Okay, so we'll get a head on this PD session for today. We will be talking about education for sustainable development and how ESD can be incorporated through low resource management. Okay, so first off, before we begin, I would like to get into what are low resource classrooms. Okay, low resource classrooms can be defined as classrooms that have limited access to traditional teaching materials, for example, worksheets, textbooks, technology, infrastructure, any kind of thing that requires funding. Maybe you don't have multimedia, maybe you don't have the kind of tools, the digital tools that you need to carry out rich resource educational practices, right? But this doesn't mean that this is a classroom where meaningful learning cannot occur. Okay, low resource classrooms are defined by constraints, and these constraints, like I said, can be things such as insufficient textbooks, overcrowded spaces, outdated or absent digital or hardware tools, and inadequate physical facilities. Okay, so they're not only limited to, let's say, the things that we need for educational purposes, such as textbooks, notebooks, pencils, pens, so on and so forth, but this may also have to do with the experience of it. So, for example, smaller spaces, classrooms that don't have an attached playground, no place for swimming or gardening or community spaces or libraries. So, all that comes under low resource classrooms. Okay, but it is not limited or constrained to just material scarcity. Other things that can create a low resource classroom are things such as teachers managing large class sizes with minimal preparation time. So, for example, one teacher might have, let's say, 30 lessons per week to 200 students in one classroom, and she doesn't have enough time, or she or he doesn't have enough time to prepare their lessons in time. Okay, so low resource classrooms can also extend towards low human resource, low preparation time, low implementation time, right? Sometimes schools have restricted operational budgets. So when you make a really good lesson plan that has 5 or 6 elements that require funding or space or time, these may not be, you may not be able to implement them because of restricted budgets, right? And then you have communities where education investments compete with immediate survival needs. So, for example, you have a proposal for a class trip that requires you taking students out to some place, to, let's say, a zoo or a playground or an animal sanctuary where you want them to research animals and flora and fauna, but you have enough funds to either do that or to provide lunch for the students for 2 more weeks. So a lot of times, the projects like the former one get sidelined or shelved because there are more pressing things to refer to. Okay, so low resource classrooms are those that have low resource, of course, the traditional kind of resources that we're talking about, for example, textbooks, multimedia, digital tools, so on and so forth. But they may also extend towards resource that include human resource, that include time, that include energy, that include implementation plans, that include community funding, school funding, so on and so forth. Okay. Another belief that we have along with low resource classrooms is that they are limited to a particular kind of place or area, but that is not true. Low resource environments can be prevalent across all sorts of cities and countries and towns and villages. You can have rural schools, you can have urban district schools, you can have regional schools, you can have refugee education programs, and even informal learning spaces that might suffer from low resources. All right, so it's something very natural, and it's something that happens on and off. It fluctuates. Sometimes you have weeks or months or terms in which the schools are able to provide high resource management, and then you have months with budget cuts when you have low resources. So it's not something that, that you need to create that you need to create a stigma around, or that needs to be, looked down upon. It's just something that comes up in education all across the world. We all face it, and there are different ways of dealing with it. But what is important is to recognize that low resource classrooms don't equal low quality education. Okay, even if you don't have the standard textbooks or the standard devices or the standard tools that a high resource school might have, that doesn't mean that you cannot create a rich educational experience for your students. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, that with low resource management, how can you create really rich programs for education and provide high quality education to all students? Okay. One other thing that I really want to get into is that a lot of times we have this preconceived notion that we have low resource classrooms and we have high resource classrooms. But something else that is common is that low resource can actually also be a choice. It can be your choice to consume less amount of resources in your classroom. So whenever you are creating a lesson or you're getting ready for a presentation or anything like that, you have to ask yourself that, do you need this many resources? Does it need to be so big? Do you need to use so many worksheets or so many textbooks, or does every child need his or her own piece of paper or their own pencil? A lot of times, a lot of teachers all over the world choose to use low resource as a means to save the environment and to generate less educational or learning byproduct. So traditional resource heavy classrooms often rely on constant material consumption, and we've noticed that as well. Before lesson plans, we're running around getting printouts, we're getting worksheets, we're getting like single use craft supplies. If we have to build models or projects, we're looking for thermopole, we're looking for paint and paint brushes and energy intensive technology. So we're looking for projectors and laptops and presentations, and that's fine, that's great to have that kind of resource in a classroom, but it's also very important to ask the question that, can we create a experience that is as rich as the one with these resources without it, right? A deliberately low resource approach can significantly reduce educational carbon footprints while modeling sustainable practices for students. Okay, so when you model these practices in a classroom, students are more likely to use them at home and otherwise as well. So it's actually, you're not only teaching sustainable development, but you're also practicing sustainable development in your teaching or instructional methods. Okay, so moving on, during this session, we're going to be covering four main types of low resource educational strategies or pedagogies. There's many more like these, but because of the time constraints of this particular PD, we're just going to be focusing on the four major ones, or the four that I like, or the four that are most easy to implement in a classroom. Okay, so the first one is going to be outdoor learning. Okay, what is outdoor learning? Outdoor learning is basically using your environment as your greatest teaching tool, right? Outdoor learning transforms any external environment into an active classroom where curriculum concepts are explored through direct environmental engagement. Okay, so for example, you're in a classroom and you have to teach about shapes. Then what you do is you don't have worksheets, you don't have anything at all, it's just you and the students. You can ask students to always look around themselves and categorize anything they see, a leaf, a plant, a tree, into different shapes. You can look at the clouds and make shapes out of them. You can look at different animals and make shapes out of them. You can be like, okay, this ladybug is round. This caterpillar is sort of like a long rectangular shape or a long oval. You can collect different types of leaves and you can see what the shape is like. You can do this through numbers as well. Like, for example, you can count the petals of a flower. You can use different flower petals for multiplication, for division. But this approach basically uses everything that an outdoor space provides as a primary learning tool. And what happens over here is that you are combining academic knowledge with real world settings. Okay, so a lot of times for children, you can do this. For middle school or high school, for example, you can look outside and be like, okay, for example, in Pakistan, we have a lot of smog. So one outdoor approach would be to go outside for a moment and actually see the smog, feel it, feel how it makes you cough, feel how it's really bad for your health, and come back indoors and maybe write about your experience in the form of a journal or a diary, or you can even write a letter to the district commissioner or your regional management and talk about the smog, right? But in that case, basically what we replaced any resource with was just outdoor learning. Okay, and because you are consciously taking children or students outside their classroom as well, this gives them an excellent opportunity to relate to the world around them, to find their place in it, and to see everything that goes on around them. Okay, why is it important? It is important because it addresses multiple learning modalities and it requires very minimal material investment. Okay, students develop spatial awareness. For example, they're able to identify, pinpoint different things in their natural environment. What is wrong, what is right, the sky is blue, the smoke is gray, there is a lot of noise pollution, there are a lot of cars outside school, there is maybe some animal trapped on the side of a road, you don't see many butterflies or you do see butterflies. So there's constant like data that you're getting from the outdoors around you. So students end up interacting with that spatial situation around them and they gain a lot of awareness because of it. And everything that they see, everything that they feel, that is used as your primary content or your primary resource. Okay, students also develop environmental consciousness. So that's the best thing that comes out of this because while you're studying a particular subject through the environment or through the world around you, you are also looking at the problems that are visible and you're consciously looking at how human beings impact the environment. Okay, and students finally also develop physical engagement with abstract concepts. So for example, when you're counting, then students are also physically engaging with the number of things. So instead of doing this in an abstract way where you're doing, okay, 2 plus 2 equals 4, you're doing 2 blades of grass plus 2 blades of grass equals 4 blades of grass, right? So everything abstract also finds a physical embodiment in the natural world, right? Um, how you implement this in your classroom obviously varies, and it depends on your learner profile and your preferences, as well as your student body, whether they're young or they're old. But major components of outdoor learning are basically collaboration, problem solving, and navigating real world challenges. Whether you want to use the outdoor world as a prompt to investigate further, whether you want to use it as a resource to understand another concept better, or whether you want to use it as an exercise to develop, mindfulness or sports or general well-being and health, that is entirely up to you and your classroom needs. Okay, how you record all of this can be in the form of really extensive or really well planned out lesson plans or teacher journals or reports later on, through which, or even students can be asked to create their own portfolios through which you can keep a record of everything that the students did in during their outdoor learning spree. If you do want to use this in your teaching practices, then here is a step by step through which you can do this. So your first step would be to conduct initial site assessment of available outdoor spaces, right? So depending on your topic, you find a outdoor space that suits your purpose. For example, if you are teaching a lesson on, let's say, numbers, or you're teaching a letter on engineering, or you're teaching a lesson on construction or architecture, then you would maybe choose a really crowded indoor space, right? Outdoor of the classroom, obviously, but indoor in a building, in a parking lot, in a basement, somewhere where students can count cars or stairs or steps or stripes on the road, whatever. If you're doing something more on like observation, maybe you can choose a community area, a park, a natural setting, a forest, some woods. You can go there, you can observe nature, animals, flora, fauna, so on and so forth, right? So before your lesson plan, how we make worksheets and how we make textbooks, in an outdoor learning scenario, you would basically conduct site assessments of the available spaces that you have, right? And then based on these initial site assessments, you will match your curriculum objectives to potential outdoor learning opportunities. Okay? Then, because this is a school and you are in charge of the safety of your students, you have to develop safety protocols and risk management procedures as well. Because once you're stepping out of the classroom, there are a lot of external variables that may or may not affect the safety of your students. So it is always good to have safety protocols in place, talk to your students about what to do, what not to do, what to be wary of, what to take care of, and so on and so forth. In an outdoor learning scenario, another thing that is very important is designing lessons through sequence. So you always start from something that's taking place indoors, and you start with that. You have a prompt or an exploration question, and then you start moving outdoors with a very clear idea of what students are actually going to be looking at. Okay, they're not going out to just play, unless, of course, it's play-based learning, but they have a mission, they have something that they're planning on doing, right? So if those instructions are clear, then your outdoor learning lesson plan becomes much more effective and impactful. Okay. As far as documentation goes, again, like I was saying, you can create simple documentation tools. This can be journals, this can be a sketchbook, this can be their notebook. Just make a page for notes or observations. This can also be voice recordings, this can be photographs, this can be anything that is available to you for recording purposes. You establish routines for transitioning between indoor and outdoor spaces, and finally, you build partnerships with community members. So, because you are leaving the classroom and going out, this is a great opportunity for students as well as yourself to make really strong community partnerships. For example, if you're going to a supermarket to maybe, let's say, conduct research on different types of food, then this is a good opportunity for students to get to know supermarket workers, to get to know people who shop at supermarkets, etc., etc. Right? So with outdoor learning, you end up building really strong relationships with people outside of a particular school premises. This could be your government bodies, it could be your regulatory bodies, it could be your small businesses, it could be even the parent body, it could be scouts, anybody in a community that runs a particular administrative structure. You end up building partnerships with them. Okay. So I've been giving you a lot of examples throughout this, but one particular example is using mathematics in outdoor learning. So this one is based on teaching about geometric shapes and using outdoor elements to identify angles, patterns, and measuring things such as building corners, calculating the amount of trees, and then how to integrate SDGs into it. For example, if you're doing climate change, then you can count the trees available in your surrounding right now as opposed to how many trees there were before. Or, for example, you can count the amount of newly planted trees against trees that have been cut or tree stumps that you find. You can count, let's say, maybe you can give them a list of things like butterflies, bees, and see how many you find in 40 minutes. So in Pakistan, we don't have a lot of butterflies anymore. So this would be a really good reflective question at the end of this mathematics lesson, that we were able to find 0 butterflies. And then you can talk about or research why the number was 0 and why we weren't able to find any more. Right? So because you're outdoor as well, this gives you a really good chance at running interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary learning as well. So you can focus on more than one subject, on more than one reflective prompt, and it just makes a overall enriching experience. Okay. Okay, what's something that's similar to outdoor learning is experiential learning. Experiential learning more or less has the same elements or has the same protocols as outdoor learning. The only difference is that it doesn't really have to be outdoor, and it's more based on thinking and observation and conceptualization than outdoor learning. Okay, you can look it up as well. Experiential learning is based on Kolb's theory, and I've pasted it over here on the right hand side. So what happens in this is that you're basically building experiences for students, and your primary resource becomes that experience, right? So for example, you want to have a lesson on time management, okay? Then what you can do is you can actually walk into your class late. You can walk into your class 10 minutes late, let's say, and then that will be your concrete experience. You can ask students to reflect on that experience and ask them questions such as, how did it make you feel to wait? What difficulties took place for the school, for the management, for you, because I was 10 minutes late? How do you feel about me as a teacher because I walked in late? But just because of that one experience that you had, you can then facilitate observation, conceptualization, and then experimentation as well. You can then provide different scenarios that, okay, what if I had walked in 5 minutes earlier? What if I had walked in exactly on time? right? And then you can pose these different questions and you can create a really strong and a really purposeful research opportunity for students through that experience. Okay. This methodology emphasizes reflection on action, connecting hands on experiences with theoretical understanding through structured processing of what students encounter, feel, discover during active engagement. Okay. If you want to talk about sustainability in particular, then your experiential learning would, for example, be if you know of an event taking place or if there's a routine in your city or area that really impacts in environment, then you can go experience it for a while. Like for example, one really common lesson plan that we have here in Pakistan that I've witnessed as well was that when students are being dropped to school, there's a lot of traffic congestion. And a lot of times teachers take their students out just to see that traffic congestion and ask them, okay, okay, you see this amount of traffic on the road. Why do you think it's taking place? What do you think is its impact? How does it make you feel? How can it be solved? And that entire learning experience is just based on that one visual of the traffic being jammed outside the school. Okay, and then all you need is a piece of paper if you want to write down notes, but otherwise it's all discussion based. Okay. So it is important because this approach transforms abstract concepts into tangible experiences and they make learning much more personal and memorable because it is things that are actively happening around students that they can see, that they can feel, and that they're a part of. Um, they end up remembering the theory along with it as well. Like, for example, if you're sitting in a classroom, in fact, I'll talk about myself back in school. If somebody ever taught me something like, let's say, overfishing, I would remember it as a concept and I would probably answer 4 out of 5 questions correctly, but it wouldn't matter to me as much if I ever went and saw fish being treated in a particular way or if I ever went and saw overfishing. Right? That is why usually in high resource classrooms we show videos, we show documentaries, we show pictures of these experiences. But if you actually take students to have these experiences, then the learning becomes more meaningful and memorable. Because of which students end up developing critical thinking, they end up developing real consequence decision making, like questions such as, okay, if I do this, then this happens. If I don't do this, this happens. For example, going back to my traffic congestion example, if I come to school in a car, this is what it looks like. If I come to school on a bicycle, I can, bypass all the traffic. I'm not emitting any carbon emission. I have parking space and I actually come to school much sooner because I'm not getting stuck in traffic, right? So you're constantly looking at the consequences, the processes of things, and then making decisions based on that. And then finally, because students are using practical skills, they end up being more confident as well, right? When you ask theoretical questions or when you ask experience-based questions, students answer from what they know best. So because of that student agency that they have, they end up building a lot of confidence and leadership skills as well. Okay. And again, this is completely minimal materials that you require for this. And the most that you get out of this is ownership and student agency. So it's a really good way of teaching a subject as well. How you can incorporate it into your lesson plans, here's a step by step. You identify authentic problems or challenges. Okay, so initially with the outdoor learning, if you remember, we were identifying sites that we could go to. Now we're identifying problems or challenges that we want to investigate. Okay, we are designing structured experiences. Like I talked about walking late into a classroom. If you have a particular experience that you want to focus on and that you want to create, you can do that. You can create that experience, curate it purposefully, and then use that as your primary resource. Okay, create reflection frameworks again. So, like with the outdoor activity, the outdoor learning, you had observation frameworks. With experiential learning, you have reflection frameworks where you're constantly asking students to reflect on how they feel, what they saw, what some solutions to the problems are, what they think, how they can make a difference, and so on and so forth. Okay. Uh, like with outdoor learning, you are establishing safe to fail environments when mistakes become learning opportunities. Okay, so there's no hard and fast rule, there's no winning or losing, there's no reward or cost system in environmental learning. It's free exploration. and it's free investigation where students are posing questions, answering them, figuring out better answers, doing more research, constantly correcting themselves. There's no safe to fail. Sorry, there's no failure. There's no fail environment in this particular learning pedagogy, right? In case you want to, go back to your lesson plan and you want assessments that you need to show to the school, to the parents, then that's where subject outcomes come in. And then, like for example, if I'm personally doing an experience-based lesson, then I would spend 40 minutes with the experience, with the reflection, and maybe my assessment would be something written at the end. Okay, so suiting the needs of your students, of your classrooms, of your organizations, you can develop assessments that sort of record the experience-based learning, because otherwise you don't have anything to show for it, right? You don't have workbooks or textbooks or projects or presentations that you can show. So it's always good to have a bit of a assessment at the end that kind of combines the academic concept as well as the experiential learning that took place. And then finally, you create systems for students to share learning with authentic audiences. This basically means that whatever students have experienced, you don't want to stop it at that. You don't want to take them outside, talk about traffic congestion, let's say, and then move on to the next thing. Students want to do something about things that they have experienced. So you give them that opportunity by giving them the space to share their learning with authentic audiences. Then maybe you could host an awareness campaign, you could do a door-to-door campaign, you could actually start asking students to bring a change themselves by carpooling, by walking to school, by bringing bicycles to school. So experiential learning is actually a gateway into change as well, and you can see it like that, right? For example, over here we have economics and experiential learning. So in an economics classroom, for example, students can be asked to make an eco-friendly marketplace, and they can be asked to imagine themselves as producers, consumers, and regulators. And you don't need much for this. You don't need to actually show up with marketplace objects. You can just have, let's say, four stations. You can have different aisles, and you can ask students to research local market conditions. You can actually go to markets, see what they're like, different kinds of markets, different kind of products, come back to your classroom, negotiate transactions, experience what supply and demand is like, how these dynamics work. But it's basically going to environments, going to experiences, replicating those experiences, finding the best solution to any problems that occur. So it's all heavily hands-on, it's all theoretical, and you need very minimal resources to create such a rich learning experience. Okay, moving on to our third one. I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, and then we'll break for questions. Is inquiry-based learning. Now, similarly with inquiry-based learning, you don't need a lot of resources, because what inquiry-based learning does is that it positions students as active investigators who develop understanding through questioning, research, and discovery rather than passive information reception. Okay, so there's nobody in a classroom giving them exact information. You're not going to a classroom and telling students to turn to chapter number 3 and open up worksheet A, B, and C and then solve them. What you're doing is that you're just giving them some questions that, okay, let's see. You can give them questions such as, is there bullying in the school? Or if there is bullying in your school, on what basis do children bully each other? Okay, and that can be a gateway into investigating minorities, into investigating health and well-being, into investigating um, disparity, discrimination, equality, so on and so forth, right? But what you're doing is that you're basically coming up with really good prompts that align with your curriculum objectives. So in this particular learning pedagogy, the time is being spent on crafting really good prompts and devising authentic questions. Okay, and guiding learners through systematic exploration processes that build both content knowledge and investigative skills. Okay, one really good way of doing this, or that I used to like, was that in a classroom, if you create a learning corner, then you can constantly make notes on that corner as a whole class. So like, for example, if you give students 40 minutes to go into their environments or into their research sections or look up information, then they can all combine this information in a corner of the classroom, whether that's on the soft board or the wall or the chalkboard or the whiteboard or whatever you have. But it's good for students to like plug in that information someplace where they can see it, so they can constantly build on it and constantly see what information is correct, what isn't, what they can do to improve it, um, etc., etc., right? But the basic part of this kind of pedagogy is inquiry, right? Because it develops critical thinking, research capabilities, and it fosters intellectual curiosity and ownership. Because you're asking a question, students are not forced, but they're encouraged to actually research the question, find answers to it, see what the question is all about, what causes it, what the context is, how it can be solved, how it can be improved. Um, a lot of times with older students especially, you can actually ask students to formulate meaningful questions as well. For example, if you have a question about environment, why is the environment in your city deteriorating? For further questioning, you can ask students to create meaningful questions. For example, they can ask questions like, what has the government done to protect trees? What have people contributed to the environment? How has the environment been deteriorating because of construction? Are new roads causing hindrances to environmental well-being? Are there too many cars? So, like, you're breaking the one big inquiry question into smaller inquiry questions that the students can then investigate themselves, right? And because they're doing this themselves, they're learning to gather information, to evaluate evidence, and they're constantly constructing knowledge collaboratively. So instead of a textbook that you give them on a particular topic, you're asking them to be the investigators, to be the researchers, to be the knowledge makers, right? And then they are prepared for lifelong learning and problem solving. Okay, and this is a step by step for inquiry based learning if you want to integrate it. So, what happens with this is that you're generating compelling questions that I'm so sorry for that ambulance in the back. I don't know if you can hear it. But anyway, you are generating compelling questions at your step number one. If you have a good question, then that goes to show that your learning will be just as beneficial or just as extensive as well. If you have a question that is narrow, then the learning wouldn't be that rich. So your question, your inquiry prompt is the one that has to be extensive, is the one that has to be in depth, and it has to be one that gives opportunities for learning. Okay. You have to teach questioning techniques that will help students make their own questions and that will help them carry out investigation. You have to create research frameworks that guide systematic exploration without constraining discovery. So, for example, you can give learners the opportunity to make mind maps, to make charts such as KWL charts, which is what you know, what you want to know, and at the end of the project, what you have learned. Okay, but again, like just like with the previous ones, because these are so heavily based on experience and they're so heavily based on personal observation and personal reflection, there is no hard and fast right and wrong. Students need to have the capacity to make mistakes, to get incorrect information, to constantly fix it themselves. And your role as a teacher in this situation is to basically facilitate them. If you see that a student is maybe researching in the wrong direction, then you kind of nudge them towards the right direction. You ask them questions like, do you think this can be something else? Do you think that maybe there's another reason for this? Do you want to go investigate this further? And you basically don't take the investigative role away from students, you just prompt them towards what you want them to get at. Okay? So it's not in all of these three pedagogies, it's not like the teacher just sets the students free and then sits down. These are actually more active ways of teaching because you have to be constantly present as a facilitator, as a mentor, as a teacher, as a guide, as a protector. And you have to make sure that kids are safe, they're learning, they're having fun, they're investigating correctly, and everything that they're doing is actually aligning to your curriculum objectives as well. Right? With inquiry-based learning, it's also really good to establish collaborative structures such as group work, or paired groups or peer work through which students can share their findings and build collective knowledge and understanding. It's good to design reflection and presentation opportunities. And then again, it's good to connect individual inquirers to a broader audience for themes in real world application. For example, if you ran an inquiry on of what? If you ran an inquiry of brick kilns, for example, and how brick kilns produce so much smoke that goes directly into the environment, maybe at the end of your pre-learning project, you can actually go to brick kiln managers and ask them about this, about what the functioning is like, what happens, what doesn't happen, so that students have the opportunity to cross-check their data, to find out more about it, to research further, and to see if they're actually right or wrong. And then this can actually be developed in different segments as well. You can have segment one where students research, segment two where they talk to somebody about it, segment three where they go back to their initial research and fix it, or edit it, or improve it, or update it. Okay. I've given lots of examples through this as well. But one example is that I really personally like is sustainability and inquiry-based learning. So, for example, if you give students an investigative question such as, why do some plants grow better in certain locations? Then you can give students time and space to actually observe plants in various school environments. They can formulate their own hypotheses, design simple experiments, and collect data over time, and then they can conduct research on plant biology, and finally they can present their findings to younger classes. And in this way, not only are they using the environment or using the outdoors as their primary means of knowledge, they're the teachers in the scenario. They're the ones who are conducting investigative research to find out the correct answers, and then they're doing one thing better. They're going one step further, and they're actually using their findings to teach younger classes, right? So then all of the discoveries that they made, these can be connected to broader scientific concepts and the curriculum and assessment. And whereas on the one hand these knowledges are being built, on the other hand there's a lot of skill development going on as well, such as data collection and scientific reasoning. Okay. Before we move on to our final last one, I would like to take a tiny little break for questions and answers. If you have any questions, any feedback, and then we can have a discussion about that. I thought we could break into rooms, but there's only 10 of us, so shouldn't be a problem. If you don't have any questions, I'll just take this time to talk about how all of these different pedagogies, when we look at them and we talk about them, we end up thinking that even these require resources. We end up thinking that these would be so much more extensive if we had printed journals, let's say, if we had printed observation forms, if we had printed mind maps, if we had textbooks and workbooks. And if we had, let's say, presentation tools, we could make it global, we could make it local. And of course, you can do that with high resource. You do have the opportunity to uplift lessons, right? But it's a really good habit to develop as well, to try and work with less and less resources. And if you look at the pure function of these pedagogies, then you don't need as many resources. You just need good questions, you need good environments. And by good, I don't mean clean, I mean environments through which you can generate really good prompts and questions and research opportunities and observation opportunities and experience opportunities, right? And as long as you have these things, you can create really meaningful learning experiences. Okay. Since you don't have any questions, we'll just quickly move on. Another thing, the last thing that we have is world building, and this is something that I personally really like, and it's something that I personally really use. because it incorporates a lot of things into it. Okay, basically what word building means is that in a classroom or in any learning environment, what you do is you create a world and you use imagination to do that, right? What happens is that you give students a prompt. Like, for example, if I'm researching, what am I researching? I'm researching water pollution, right? And I live in a city that doesn't have a sea or a river or a lake or any water body. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a city in my head or as a class that has water that is being polluted. Now, what this does is that this requires deep inquiry. It requires imagination, it requires creativity, and it requires an understanding of systems. Okay, so you're asking students to imagine a world. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to need is spatial awareness. What are water bodies? Where are water bodies found? What pollutes water bodies? Second thing you need is building relationships. Okay, so like, okay, water bodies are being polluted. How? Who's polluting them? What is the pollution like? This pollution affects which parts of the water bodies? For example, the plastic. How is it impacting water bodies? It's impacting the biodiversity, it's impacting the environment, it's impacting the birds, it's impacting, this is microplastic. So you're building all of that, all of those connections. And then not only are you building these connections, building knowledges and building understanding, then you're also remembering all of this. So it's a really good exercise for memory as well, because for example, on Monday I come and I build a world, and on Tuesday I resume it, then I expect students to learn what they built on Monday, right? And then it's just building upon, it's like building blocks one after the other. So even if I run this for a month, all I have are notes and observation points, and maybe some sketches, maybe some drawings, and we have proper worlds with proper problems that we can solve. Okay. And these problems, of course, are linked to your curriculum. But what basically word building does, it synthesizes multiple cross-disciplinary objectives. It leads to systems thinking and creative problem solving. Okay, students understand historical patterns. How do things take place? How do things take place even now? How will things take place? Right? They understand scientific principles because they're using those principles to build their world. And then finally, they also understand social structures and cultural dynamics. What are people like? What are some cross-cultural relationships? How are people in our world interacting? How are people in our world interacting with nature, with plants, with animals? How are things functioning together? They're learning all of this by implementing it to make their own world, right? And while doing all of this, they're working towards a shared creative goal. So, for example, if my other question is that how can we save turtles, right? Um, then through the world building, we are ultimately culminating to a point where we create a solution, we implement it in our world, we see how our world reacts, we change it, we scrap it, we make a new one, we make a third one, we make a fourth one, and through constant imaginative experimentation, um, we keep building on the same solution, or we keep building new ones to see which one is most effective. And then we use that um, in our real world application as well, right? But the process in itself only requires imagination and very minimal resources, such as things on which you can take note or observational tools, just basic materials such as a pencil and a paper, let's say. Or not even that, a lot of times this can also just be in your head. Okay. If you want to look at this in a step-by-step manner, then you can see that the first thing you're going to do is establish parameters for world building that align with curriculum objectives, right? So whatever the curriculum you're teaching, for example, you're teaching languages and you're looking at how um, not knowing a particular language causes alienation, or you're looking at, let's say, grammar, or you're looking at punctuation, and you're saying that, okay, let's investigate correct punctuation, right? Then you end up building a really humorous world in which punctuation is minimal and people are speaking really confusing or words, or they are making up really confusing sentences, or there's a lot of miscommunication that's leading to chaos and anarchy and stuff like that. So your entire world is built around that idea, and then how you're investigating that world is through what correct punctuation looks like. Okay, so that's just an example. Not to do with sustainability, but with any curriculum objective, right? So whatever curriculum objective you have, you turn it into a prompt or a problem or a question around which students build a world, right? While they're building the world, the first step would be to go through systematic world development. They're looking at the geography, the history, the culture, the system, the people, the animals, um, the characteristics, the environment, and they're building a world in great detail. Okay. Then they're looking at collaborative structures that allow different students to contribute specialized knowledge. So, for example, in a group of four, one student can be in charge of the people, one student can be in charge of history, one student can be in charge of the language, one can be in charge of different kinds of animals. You can ask students to be as creative as possible. They could even make a world with monsters, with aliens, with any kind of mythical creature or mystical creature or fictional creature or robots, completely their choice, right? But you give them roles that depend on their specialized knowledges, and then they can build these worlds together as well, right? Finally, just like with every other pedagogy that we've talked about, you develop documentation methods appropriate to your project or your lesson. So you can have maps, narratives, presentations, whatever resources you have, you can ask students to use them to record their world, to make maps, to make narratives, to make points that they can build on, that they can solve, that they can think about further. Okay? And everything that you do in the fictional world, you can connect it to a real world academic element as well. For example, your world doesn't have any cars, and you can talk about how many cars there are in the real world. Your world has, let's say, it has lots of markhors, but in your real world, in the Pakistani context, they are an endangered species. So, whatever element you add into your fictional world, is always good to create a connection between the real life world as well. Okay. You establish presentation opportunities through which students can actually present their their imaginative worlds to their class fellows, find out more solutions, get perspectives, get an idea of what other people would do if they were in their shoes, collaborate, communicate, think critically and creatively. And finally, use the world building projects as context for exploring academic concepts. Okay, so whatever the world is, it links back to an academic concept that is being explored or investigated. Okay, and again, this is something that is so heavy on words, and when I talk about it, the first thing that you think of or anybody thinks of is that, oh, we're going to need so many resources for this. But you don't need resources for it. You need really good planning, and you need a really good progression, and you need a really good understanding of how students will go from point A to point D, for example. And the better you facilitate a world building lesson, the better it would be in terms of the learning experience, the academic outcome, the success criteria, and the assessment. But resource wise, it is going to need very minimal resources because it's basically just imagination, research, inquiry, collaboration, and presentation. Okay. An example of this is environmental studies and world building. So, for example, students studying environmental science can create fictional ecosystems, design food webs, climate patterns, and species relationships that demonstrate ecological principles. Working in teams, they can develop detailed documentation using drawings, written descriptions, and simple models created from available materials. Students can represent their ecosystems to other classes. They can talk about how their ecosystems are threatened, how their ecosystems can be saved. And then all of this knowledge can be linked back to curriculum guidelines or curriculum objectives, in which your lesson may actually be about, let's say, endangerment or environmental degradation, or um, ways in which you can save different ecosystems. Okay, but the world building exercise in itself, for this, you don't even need an experience or an outdoor setting or a site. or an inquiry question. You just need a prompt, you need a really good idea, and you just need to run with it to build the world. In high resource situations, world building is also an exercise, and it takes place through tools such as Minecraft, where students can, build their own worlds physically, virtually, sorry, and they can actually visit these worlds and see what they're all about. A lot of schools all over the world also use this in their art classes, where students can draw their worlds, draw characters from their worlds, use extensive mind maps, planning maps, infrastructural maps, and create like really profound dioramas to show their world as well. But in the low resource management situation, this world can be purely imaginative. And this is something that I prefer, because if it's imaginative, then the scope is gigantic and the scope is massive, and the space to ask hypothetical questions is so much more. So as a facilitator, as a teacher, you can jump into students' worlds and you can pose different questions and ask them, okay, if this building was like this, what would that look like? What would that do? For example, if you start, let's say, growing plants on all buildings, what would the city look like? What would that do for the environment? What if trees grew horizontally out of houses and buildings? Would that save space? What would that look like? So that kind of questioning, that kind of back and forth, it leads to like really rich and really profound learning experiences. Okay. So in this session, what we ended up doing was we ended up learning about four main types of low resource pedagogies that you can use in the case of low resource management. There are so many more like these. If you just research on your own as well, or maybe we can do a follow-up of it as well. But these are something that would be great for you to implement in your own classes as well, because for these, you don't need funding, you don't need permission, you don't need printing facilities, you don't need distributing facilities. They're also great because they cut across classroom issues such as students forgetting their books, students forgetting their backpacks. You can do this in 40 minutes, you can do this in 3 months, depending on your prompt, depending on how you plan it. So there's a lot of a lot of room for personalization, a lot of room for context specificness, a lot of room for catering to special needs, to catering to all student needs, to catering to differentiation. That's completely your choice. All you need at the end of the day is really good planning and really good beforehand research for you to actually build either the outdoor experience or the experience or the inquiry or the world building exercise. Okay, so that's it from my end, and we can break to questions now. And I will stop sharing for a while. And if you have any questions, you can ask them. We can discuss what we talked about. Okay, if you don't have any questions at all, then I guess we can call it a day. And I can do some follow-up questions later on when I get an opportunity to interact with you all. But I do request that you use these pedagogies in your classrooms and reflect on them, and maybe let me know how it felt, okay? Or if it even helped you, or how your students responded to them. And I could share more ideas and projects and lessons with you as well, right? But thank you for joining, and it was so good to have you all here, and I hope to see you all again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you so much, Miss.
Thank you for joining. I really hope it helped.